Welcome to Workin It Out with Dr. V. Today's guest is HR expert Salandra Fleming with co-host Norman Bailey. Got problems on the job, we're working it out.
With Dr.
Workplace got you stressing, we're working it out.
With Dr.
Yeah, we're working it out, working it out, working it out. Dr. V.
Welcome to Workin It Out with Dr. V on HUR Voices Sirius XM Channel 141. We're your talk show that helps you triumph over workplace stress. And today we're excited to continue the HR series, which is a new feature of our program, and our focus is on bullying in the workplace. And as we talked about in our previous series, this is a real issue in the workplace, affecting at least 50% of people indicate that they're bullied, and it costs American industry a lot of money. We're talking about $3 billion, Norm, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
And I am going to have, and I'm continue to be blessed to have Norman Bailey, my co-host on the show.
So glad to be with you, Doc.
Yeah, and we talk about this bullying. I'm feeling a little bit better. I'm still struggling with this cold, but thank you, Norm. And we have again with us the renowned HR expert, Miss Salandra Fleming.
That she is.
And she, not Flemings, but Fleming.
Thank
and
you.
she is taking us through this whole bullying series, and it's really focused on what are your rights? What are the things you should think about doing, you can do, and maybe you shouldn't do in addressing bullying in the workplace. So, Salandra, can we just have you again describe for us what is bullying in the workplace and why is that important?
Yes.
Sure. And
for us to talk about.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here.
Glad
You're
to have
awesome. We're glad you came back to us.
you. Indeed.
And such an important topic, as you've noted. There's a lot of cases that have been documented on workplace bullying. There's actually a Workplace Bullying Institute that does a number of statistical analysis on bullying in the workplace. So 40% of bullying is said to be done by peers, so peer-to-peer bullying. And the kind of behavior we're talking about is really competitive, perhaps pervasive behavior that belittles or threatens one in the workplace, intended to dominate, to incite fear, and to control. And it is usually born out of the need to have control. When you feel out of control yourself, then you have to take extreme measures. Some choose to take extreme measures to gain control, and that is often done by sabotaging the work of someone else, by damaging their professional reputation, by cutting them out of communications, belittling their contribution on projects. This really shows up in a number of ways at work, and it's very unfortunate.
Well, Salandra, it's really interesting because in our previous show, we talked about my boss is a bully. What are my rights? And
Yes.
so today we want to focus on my peers are sabotaging me and bullying me. What are my rights? So it's interesting that you describe the bully peer, the peer that's a bully, in ways similar to how you describe the bully boss. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that it's just a matter of position.
Really?
And having the position of authority, but the behavior can play out in the same way. Obviously, the boss will have some position of authority, so they'll be able to control the workload. So they might do things like assigning an unreasonably large workload with very little turnaround time.
Okay.
Well, a peer might not have that ability, but they're going to do some other things in the workplace that do play out in some of the same ways, including this term called mobbing, where you invite other people in to join in that behavior.
Mobbing?
Mobbing. Wow.
MOBBING.
Absolutely.
Wow. How pervasive is that?
Well, it's actually, we talked about bosses being a bully on the other show. It's actually much of what happens if your supervisor is the bully. It is a little less the case with peer-to-peer, but it's 30 to 40% of the case involves more than one person. So you go get someone in your corner and you have them participate in the activity, or it can be unknowingly getting someone to buy into this, reputation that you're trying to damage, or something negative that you've spread through rumors or innuendos in the workplace.
So that makes a person feel even more vulnerable. It's one thing to be bullied by one person.
Absolutely.
But now you're talking about two or more people that are engaged in the same bullying.
Absolutely.
Is there something about the individual that suggests that they can be bullied? Is there some behavior or way that they present themselves that say, hey, I'm bully material here?
That's a good question. I haven't found evidence that suggests that.
Okay.
But what I would say is that someone who allows it to be the case and doesn't take control of that situation soon enough, and we'll talk about some of the measures that they can do,
Right.
will allow that to be a continuing issue in the workplace when it otherwise could be squashed.
Okay. So people get a sense that you're not going to push back, that you're not going to respond to it in a way
It's
that
like feeding on the prey.
feeding on the prey.
So it doesn't really tie to a personality type, because I guess, when I hear about it and we talk about it, people kind of assume it may be the quiet one or the unassuming person, but it sounds like what you're saying. I could be the happy-go-lucky one and still fall victim or, impacted by this behavior.
Absolutely. It's not necessarily the case that you have a certain profile that allows you to be a target.
So from your perspective as an HR expert and an HR specialist, what would you suggest that a person that is experiencing peer bullying do?
Well, as an HR professional, I would definitely suggest that you go to your HR person. Talk to them about the policies that exist in your organization, comb through the handbook and find the language that relates to bullying and harassment if it escalates to that level or if it qualifies for that, and talk to your supervisor, number 2, because we're talking about peer-to-peer bullying in this case. So talk to your HR person, talk to your supervisor, and document. HR should do their share of documentation, but you should do it too.
So why document?
Yes.
You need a track record of the behaviors, who was a witness, and again, HR should be doing this, but they might not be in the loop on things if you haven't told them soon enough or, whatever the case may be. But you should document what the behavior is, the impact, if you can, and any other witnesses that might be a part of an investigation if it comes to that level.
Now, when you say document, you mean literally write it down?
Write it all down.
And then what do you do with it once it's written down? Do you give it to HR? Do you keep your own copy? Do you give it to an attorney? Document for
Always
what?
keep your own copy. Always keep your own copy.
Out of the office?
And yes, I in or out. I don't know that it matters. If you're still at the organization, it should still be accessible to you. But most people have a flash drive or something,
I was gonna say.
But in or out of the office, as long as you keep it, you still have it. And give a copy to HR. That can facilitate their documentation, and they'll probably add to it. If it's something that requires an investigation, not all cases do, then they can use that to supplement their documentation.
Now let me ask you this, because you mentioned as a possible action or step I could take is to go to my supervisor, and we talked about it. This is a pervasive environment in terms of culture. Now, if I got a bully boss and this is going on, can I still? I might not be comfortable going to the boss, so can I go to HR around the boss? How does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good question. I say HR first because your HR person is trained in dealing with this kind of issue. They're trained in dealing with conflicts, typical ones, abnormal ones. They're trained in dealing with employee relations, behaviors, and things that are a problem in the workplace. They're trained with employment laws, so they'll know what your legal rights are. And they wrote the policies, or they're following or implementing the policies, so they know the steps to take and the appropriate actions to take.
Well, let me ask you a question that's kind of shifting to the impact on the person that's being bullied, right? And when we talked about my boss is a bully, we talked about post-traumatic stress disorder, PSTD, as being resident in those people that report to a bullying supervisor.
Absolutely.
Can that also occur with a person that's being bullied by their peers? Can they have PSTD as a result of that?
Yes.
Talk a little bit to us about that.
Yeah, there are reports on all in both instances, peer-on-peer bullying and boss-to-peer bullying, with individuals developing eating disorders, anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD. So it has its physiological effects as well as emotional effects, which, of course, those are tied together. It impacts your relationships at work. It impacts your relationships at home. Many people have reported seeing a counselor as a result of bullying in the workplace. And I've dealt with cases in my professional history where people are impacted in physiological ways. They can't eat, they can't sleep. They're questioning themselves. They're digesting information at night, wondering, what I did wrong.
So they're internalizing the bullying behavior.
Absolutely.
Well, it was interesting because one of the stats, and I love stats in particular, we think it's important because a lot of times people think this is kind of one-off or soft kind of topics we're having. But we know that it costs $250 million a year in just health claim expenditures because of peer-to-peer bullying. So this is real.
And some folks just quit and say, I can't do it anymore.
Yeah, just quit. We're not even talking about the loss in jobs and productivity.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, there are times, unfortunately, where it just might be time to quit. Unfortunately, every organization might not have a supportive process for dealing with this in the workplace, and some employers might tolerate it, unfortunately. And if you find that you can't get the support you need, you can't get the resolution you need, and your health is is an expense of such cases, then it might be time to leave if you can't resolve it internally.
Well, so what is the supportive process? I mean, how would one know that their organization has a supportive process? What should they look for?
Right. Well, they should look for the policies that are in your handbook. There will either be a code of conduct or just guidelines on how they want to treat people in the workplace. Many have operating values and harassment policies. These are all things that you should look for. They're usually towards the front of the handbook because they're the legalese that
must it's hard to read through all of that.
Whistleblower policies. Yeah, that's why I would take it to HR. Would read it yourself, and you probably have something in your file that says you read it when you came, but you probably didn't read it. So read it yourself, and then take those portions of the handbook to HR and go through them together and digest that information together.
Well, so I just say I read the handbook and I got all that and it's there and this stuff's going on, and I've got to be thinking, look, now these people say they got these rules.
Right.
Are they really backing them?
They might not know about it.
Why are these people acting like this?
That's why you need to let them know.
Who might not know about it? The
supervisors or HR. You have to tell them and tell them quickly. I would not wait until it gets to a certain point. I would loop them in soon, even if it's just to say, there's something going on and I'm not sure exactly what to make of it, but let me give you a couple of situations. Just keep them for your record. I'm not really sure what we should do about them. And then they have notice, and if something happens, if it's a week or 2 weeks later, then there's a history that's beginning to develop.
It's like this pattern that you talked about earlier.
Absolutely.
In our previous show.
Yeah. So they might not know. I would make sure they know. When you put the employer on notice, then they have the responsibility to act if it's severe enough to do so.
Well, you talked about have a conversation with the supervisor. It seems to me that the supervisor is the most critical person to interface with, but I think I heard you say HR. So I wanted to get your perspective when we come back from commercial break on what is the specific role of the supervisor. I mean, what should if you had the best of all worlds, what would a supervisor be doing to address this peer bullying?
Right, that's a great way to frame the question. What a supervisor should be is a support and protection for employees and their right to come to work in a bully-free environment.
Okay.
So your supervisor should be prepared to also take it to HR, who's trained to deal with these instances, and follow a very particular process to resolving it. And HR is going to have a remedy for this depending on how severe the actions are.
Now, real quick, so as a supervisor, I'm hearing you say, do they have accountability where they must take it, or is that an option for them?
It depends on how severe the behavior is.
Okay.
If it's something that's happening on a project and it's something they feel they can handle, I think it's always a good idea to take it to HR, who's specifically trained in these kinds of issues. But it could be something that they can handle and maybe they can squash it. I would still document it, and then you still have your record to pick up later.
Well, I'm Dr. V along with my co-host Norman Bailey, and we're going to have to take a commercial break. But our topic today is really my peers are sabotaging me and driving me nuts. And it's part of our continuation on workplace bullying. We'll be right back after this commercial break. This is Working It Out with Dr. V on HUR Voices, Sirius XM Channel 141.
Share your questions for Dr. V and Norman B. by emailing us at drv@workingitoutradio.com or normanb@workingitoutradio.com.
Welcome back to Working It Out with Dr. V. And today, along with my esteemed co-host Norman Bailey, we have Miss Salandra Fleming, who is an HR expert.
Yes, she
and
is.
She's renowned all over the world. And we're engaged in a series on workplace bullying. And our specific topic today is bullying from peers.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, my peers are sabotaging me and driving me nuts. What am I right?
Indeed.
And we talked a little bit about what are some steps or actions that people should do if they feel like they're being bullied by peers. So we want to dial it back a little bit, Salandra, and talk about What are the signs and signals that you're being bullied? Because some people's perception of being bullied might not be. Other people might say, "I was just joking. I wasn't really being serious." So, how do you know? What should you look for when you're being bullied?
Right. So from an employer's perspective, this is the importance of having your thumb on the pulse of the organization and knowing your staff. So you want to look for shifts in behavior. You want to look for changes in productivity. If you notice things are normally getting done within a certain time frame and they're no longer getting done, then you might want to ask some questions about that.
Is that on an individual or like a more group team basis?
It could be either. It depends on how the work is structured and how the accountability falls. So if you know how things are normally getting done in the organization or on the team and things are starting to shift, then you want to ask some questions. If you start noticing a different pattern of absenteeism, sometimes that's a sign that there's bullying. If you start noticing avoidance behaviors, someone who's not coming to a meeting or who's not on time, or someone who's quiet at a meeting, or someone who has just an extreme 180 in their behavioral behavior in the workplace, whether it's meetings or one-on-one settings. Watch the water cooler, because that's where a lot of things, if you don't have a water cooler, wherever you keep your water, then watch what's going on and who's talking. Absolutely. Who's talking to whom in the workplace, and what are the shifts in patterns, or do you notice a lot of hush-hush, or you walk in the room and it gets quiet? Something's going on.
So it's interesting because those examples are what a supervisor should be in tune to.
Yes.
And many times supervisors say, I'm so maxed out with just so much work to do. The span of control that I have in terms of the number of people who report to me doesn't give me time to figure out or see anything.
Right.
But what I hear you saying is that really is not an acceptable excuse.
It's really
As
not.
a supervisor, it really is your responsibility to stay in tune to these kind of nuances that are, and they're really not a nuance, but really changes in behavior that are happening with individuals in your organization.
Yeah.
Are supervisors being held accountable for that? Because a lot of times people do what they think they're being held accountable for. Are organizations holding their people accountable for their supervisors for being sensitive to bullying?
I would say that the statistics show that they're not. Many employers have their head buried and they're not paying attention to what's going on in the workplace. And even if they have some hint that it's going on, the data shows that they're dismissing it. This doesn't happen here. No, not my people. Maybe somewhere else. Or no, my team is good. Look at our results, when they could be doing something different or something more. So they're really not being held accountable for that behavior, and they're really not as clued in as they could be.
So then is there potential that they are, in fact, because they're not being held accountable, that they're helping to create a hostile work environment?
I was going to say.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that could be so. One of the things that I think is important is to distinguish between what is characterized as bullying. We talked about repetitive behavior that could be characterized as hostile, as a pattern of behavior that is designed to intimidate a coworker. And then a hostile work environment is a term that is actually coined by the EEOC, used by the EEOC, and it's a legal term that describes harassing and employment discrimination for protected classes. So hostile work environment is illegal. Harassment is illegal, particularly if you're a member of a protected class.
Which is what?
Age, race, color, disability, if you're in California or D.C., sexual status, sexual orientation. So there are 6 or 7 categories in the federal law that qualifies hostile work environment and harassment. And then if you're in places like California or D.C., then there are stricter laws and a human rights code that is in place.
Now, what if I'm not a member of one of those groups and I feel like, this is going on and, and it's crazy around here? Do I have any rights?
Then technically, I can say it's not illegal. It's not that you don't have rights, but it might not be covered under the law. There are a few cases where bullying has risen to the status of hostile work environment because it is so severe and so pervasive, and it has resulted in serious either stress levels or health conditions, or what they call constructive discharge. And that means that the environment was so intolerable that the person had to leave. And then the former employee turns around and sues the employer, or you can file a civil suit, actually, you always have the option of filing a civil suit against the offender.
Now I'm curious, if I can pick up that, because when you talk about work hostile environment, can that be a peer-to-peer thing where peers can be held accountable for hostile versus the boss who's really in charge? I mean, I just work here. How you gonna hold me to that same standard? I'm curious.
If you can prove that the employer knew about the pattern and didn't do anything to resolve it, and if it's severe enough, it could qualify as hostile work environment.
Wow.
This is news.
Yes.
So it becomes even more important for a supervisor and their organization to really get on top of this whole notion of bullying, because they can be personally liable as well as the organization can be liable.
Right, and I'll say there is more chance of damages being awarded or a lawsuit being successful for a protected class. That's protected by the law. If you're not a member of a protected class, it's not technically covered by the law, but it doesn't mean that more cases won't pop up. I mean, things evolve.
So this really adds even more importance to the comment that you made before break around document.
Absolutely.
I see.
Yeah, after a couple of months pass, you don't remember the day, you don't remember where you were, you don't remember who else was involved. When something happens and it piques your interest, and you say something's wrong and I need to pay attention, write it down. Okay.
Now give me an example of what that's something wrong. Because again, I think you, Doc, mentioned people sometimes suffer, struggle with, what does it look like? Because I might make file away out that, but they were just kind of kidding.
Yeah.
Then it comes up 2 or 3 more times. Now I got to say, I didn't kind of write it down the first time. Help me with that.
And that's why the repetitive and ongoing is an important aspect of that definition, because you might just dismiss it a few times. When you start to notice it, then you know it's happened before. Maybe you've already tried to address it and it wasn't resolved and it's happening again. So when you notice that something is off and it's impacting your work or the team or the environment, then you want to make note of it.
Okay. Salandra, you talked a lot about putting voice to it by talking to your supervisor or to the HR person or to somebody who's a sponsor or advocate for you in the organization. But it seems to me that courage is such a critical element of this, right? Because when we do our work with Norm and I did something on domestic violence, the whole notion of people putting voice to their abuse was very, very critical in the work that we were doing. And it seems to me that people have to find the courage, the intestinal fortitude to speak and put voice to the situation that they're encountering. And sometimes maybe they are wrong, but they risk less, it seems to me, by putting voice to it. How can we support, or how are organizations helping people to come out about bullying in the workplace?
Absolutely. I think it's important to recognize that a situation loses its power when you make it public. And by public, I don't mean everybody knows, but somebody knows. It's no longer a secret. So it's the same thing that you hear with domestic abuse and bullying in schools and other abusive situations, that it loses its power, and even addiction loses its power once you tell somebody, because then you sort of not only let the steam out and you let out some of the anxiety that has built up if you're holding it yourself, but you have an ally, you have another voice, you have another opinion, you have someone else to help give you strength. That's what we're here for. That's why we're not working solo, because we have other people that are there to support us.
Well, speaking of that, so many people that work around you are your peers. So is there a way to generate more support of your peers to kind of help deal with the other peer bullying?
So my responsible HR side says, tell someone in a position of power, because sometimes what can happen is people will tell their peers, not tell a supervisor or HR, someone in a position of power, and the organization doesn't have a clue what's going on, and then you've just spread the rumor or spread the situation to employees, but there's no power in the situation to do something about it.
So people have a tendency to talk more to their peers about it than to people who can really affect change on that situation.
Unfortunately, yes.
Oh, I see.
And it's not to say that a grassroots effort might not cure the situation, but I think to be responsible, I would say tell someone in a position of authority.
Now, let me ask, we have about 2.5 minutes left, and I just want to make sure that we get your perspective on kind of what were some highlights from our conversation with Salandra today on peer bullying.
Well, I tell you one of the things that really jumped out at me, I think we talked about early on, and that there's no profile for being bullied. I think sometimes we have a perception around who that person is, and that somehow we may be just, prone to it because of our own personality traits. I think that was a big one for me. The other thing, too, that you're saying is that, make sure you tell somebody, and somebody in authority. Sharing it with the friend may get you some support, but it may not get the answer, may not get resolution.
Right.
So those are two big things that really stood out for me.
Yeah, and I think for me, I like to add the whole notion of having individual courage.
Yes.
Finding a way to find your voice, to take that chance, that risk to step out and talk to somebody, as you were saying, Norman, but some kind of way, just
to get it out there.
Right. Because as you said, Salandra, that really takes the power away from the bullier. And the other piece that I wanted to talk about a little bit, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but we can continue since this is a 3-part series, it's the whole notion of how do you check yourself? Because in so many situations that Norm and I have been in, a lot of times a person is complaining about certain situations in the workplace, and then when we investigate and peel the onion, it's oftentimes that person who is the kind of center of the issue.
Exactly.
And
the constant in the situation.
So we will want to encourage those individuals to do a self-check as part of this process of exploring and examining peer bullying.
And for people who might say, I don't trust my supervisor or HR, test that as well, because you don't want to forfeit your benefits and your rights to get through a system and to have the process work for you because of a perceived trust issue, if that's really not the case.
And that's really important because that's a lot quicker and cheaper than litigating.
It sure is.
Well, I'm your host, Dr. V, on HUR Voices, Sirius XM Channel 141, and our show is Working It Out, and our focus today is on peer bullying. And I'd like to thank, first of all, my co-host, Norman Bailey.
My esteemed pleasure.
My esteemed co-host, Norman Bailey.
Well, thank you, ma'am.
And we are just delighted to also thank Salandra Fleming. This is her part 2 of the series, and we're going to have Salandra continue with us in a part 3 when we're going to talk about discrimination and harassment in the workplace, as well as performance management. And we want you to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hey, we are out there.
We're out there. We want you to send your questions to us, and we will be answering those questions as well as on our series. Yeah. I'm signing out. This is Working It Out with Dr. V on HUR Voices, Sirius XM Channel 141.
Email your work-related questions to www.workingitout.com.